Great. Thank you so much, Jose Luis, for that introduction, and Carly for inviting me, and all of you for turning up. So as was already said, one of my main lines of work has been looking at gossip in a multitude of different ways. But today I'm going to be talking about a program of work that's on the lines of the title here, Truth, Lies, and Gossip. And effectively in this program of work, I've been really interested in understanding what some of the functions of gossip are, particularly in terms of contributing to cooperation in social groups. But as is implied by the title, it's not just what the functions are, but what is inaccuracy or people's tendencies to tell lies? How does that maybe have an impact on those functions? I'm going to be talking about three papers in this program of work, and my collaborator on all those papers is Miguel Fonseca, who's in the economics department here at the University of Exeter. So the starting point for this program of work were claims that our everyday gossip, and by that I mean just the information that we share with one another about the characteristics and behaviors of other people, may be a naturally occurring reputational system. In other words, it's a way in which in an everyday setting, we get to find out about what the people around us are like, what they've done in the past, and that this may help us to understand what they're likely to do in the future. Now, if gossip is a source of accurate reputational information, then that can be expected to have important consequences. So in particular, we can expect that it should shore up levels of cooperation in social groups. And that should be particularly the case if those social groups are quite large and if they're mobile. So situations where we're interacting with people that we don't know very well on a fairly frequent basis. Now, to understand why this gossip could be expected to shore up cooperation, there are two main reasons for this. So the first is that if gossip is a naturally occurring reputation system, then it should allow us to discriminate between people in useful ways. So if we get a piece of gossip that describes someone as being more cooperative or less cooperative, and we pay attention to that, that should then affect the way in which we interact with that particular person. And if I, for instance, want to find someone to cooperate with, then gossip can potentially allow me to identify who are good people to target for cooperation and which people have defected in the past, so I should avoid. This should shore up cooperation because it means that cooperators should be better able to find each other and have profitable interactions. But there's another and related reason why gossip can be expected to shore up cooperation. And that's because it can create incentives for doing the things that allow you to build a positive reputation. So being cooperative involves some short-term costs, but if you know that being cooperative pays off in the long term because other people are going to seek you out because you have a good reputation, it makes it more worthwhile to be cooperative. So together, by allowing gossip-based discrimination and then incentivizing strategic reputation building, we can expect that gossip should lead to more cooperation. But when these arguments have been made in the literature, one of the common responses is that, okay, well, that's all well and good, at least theoretically, but, you know, gossipers can lie. It's a piece of communication, and coming up with words that are untrue is not harder than coming up with words that are true. So what's to make sure that people actually tell the truth, that they send honest signals about others when they gossip? And so this is very problematic if it's true, or at least it seems to be. So as I said at the bottom there, it's like this argument around the functions of gossip really assume that that gossip needs to be pretty accurate. And if gossip is, if people are describing other people as being more positive than they are or more negative than they are, then it should no longer help us to shore up cooperation. So if we look at the mechanisms, you can see that if the information that you receive through gossip is untrustworthy and unreliable, then we should stop engaging in discrimination on the back of the information that we hear. So we should just ignore it. And if people are ignoring the information that's in gossip, then the incentives for cooperating to build a positive reputation are decreasing as well. So you should get less strategic reputation building. So if you have inaccurate gossip, then gossip should not be able to shore up cooperation. At least that's the argument. So in this program of work, we were interested in exploring some of these assumptions in this kind of argument in more detail. So there is that assumption that gossip needs to be accurate to fulfill reputational functions and to bolster cooperation. Now, while there had been theoretical claims that this was important and it had been tested in some agent-based models, when we first did this work, there wasn't any behavioral evidence that could really speak to that. So we really wanted to say, in a behavioral setting, is this true? Does gossip need to be accurate to be effective? As I also said, one of the critiques that's often brought up around gossip is the idea that gossips will just lie readily. It's very easy to lie, and therefore they will lie. And so often people say, well, inaccuracy is really the fatal flaw of gossip. So gossip has potential, but it's inaccurate. And so that means it's not going to work very well. And so we were also interested in just starting to explore this. So is it the case that people spontaneously lie when they tell gossip? If they do, when do they lie? And why do they do that? What are the kinds of functions they're trying to achieve when they lie? And the final question that I'll discuss here is a project where we were interested in doing a very first test of one mechanism that has been suggested in the literature as potentially dealing with this issue of inaccuracy in gossip. So what some people have suggested is that, okay, well, gossipers may lie, but maybe there could be social sanctions in society which limit the extent to which they do so. So, if people value honest gossip and someone tells them a lie, they may punish that person. And if there's a risk of punishment, that may be the mechanism that makes sure that gossipers tell the truth. So in this project, we were interested in understanding whether people do actually impose costs on dishonest gossipers. All right, so this program of work is behavioral. It's all in the lab, experimental work. And it all uses the same kind of experimental paradigm. So what I'm just going to do now is take you through that paradigm, just so that you understand the particular approach that we've used for trying to answer these questions. Now, of course, that paradigm has been useful enough for us to use it across a range of different projects, but it also has limitations, and it's important to understand that as well. So this paradigm is one we call the trust game with gossip paradigm. And in this paradigm, we brought participants into the lab. And so there would be groups of between 8 and 16 individuals who would form a particular network. And they would come into the lab and they would interact over networked computers in an anonymous way. Because my collaborator is an experimental economist, we were incentivizing everything. So participants were paid on the back of their performance. And on average, they earned between 10 and 12 pounds for participating. Now, in terms of what that paradigm actually is, as I said, it's a trust game paradigm. So participants in this, in all these studies, played one-shot trust games. And so in a given round, they would be paired up with a partner. They would play a trust game. And then between rounds, our key manipulation was the reputational information that was able to flow between those rounds. To really ensure that we could understand the impact of reputational information, these players were playing anonymously, and they were also randomly allocated to partners from one round to the next. With one exception, they knew that they would never play with the same person twice. So in this way, we removed direct reciprocity processes from the game. And it was also not possible to learn over time about a particular person's behavior. So we're really only looking at reputation and indirect reciprocity processes. Because we were using the trust game, participants were allocated to two roles. They could either be the trustor, which we called the investor. So this is the person who gets an endowment and can decide how much they trust their partner by sending some of that endowment to the partner. And the other role we called the agent role. This is the person who receives some endowment, and that person can then decide how trustworthy they're going to be in terms of how much they're actually going to return. The roles that were allocated are retained throughout the study. So you're an investor or an agent from the beginning to the end. It was the investors that were able to gossip to one another about the behavior of their agents. So we're generally most interested in what investors do in these studies. You may be familiar with trust games, but just in case you aren't, I'm just going to show in a little bit more detail what it looked like. So in each round, there was this one-shot trust game. We have an investor who has an endowment. That endowment is 10, what we call experimental currency units, or ECUs. And they can send any whole number between 0 and 10 to their agent. Anything they send is multiplied by 3, as is standard in the trust game. That agent then can decide how many of the received units that they receive they want to return to the investor, and that can be between 0 to all of the tokens that they receive. The investor then, both players are informed about their payoffs, and the investor is asked, what do you want the next person who's going to play with your current agent to know about what happened? And then they write a piece of gossip. Now, importantly, what we have done in this series of studies is we've used numerical gossip. So other researchers have asked people to actually write a story about what happened. But we asked investors to say, tell the next investor to play your current agent how many tokens you sent, and then how many of the received tokens that agent actually returned to you. So as I said before, the decision about how many tokens to send is a proxy for how much they trusted the agent, and the percentage or proportion of received tokens that were returned by the agent is a proxy for how trustworthy that agent is. So that piece of gossip is written. As I said, the actual factual behavior is presented on the screen, so it's not possible for people to forget about what happened. And we use numerical gossip because it allowed us to very precisely say, were people telling the truth or not? And if they weren't telling the truth, in what way were they not telling the truth? So then that gossip would be passed on to the next investor in the beginning of the next round. They would play with the same agent as before, send their own gossip, and so on. And this would go through all the rounds, usually between 15 and 20, depending on the experiment. And obviously all the people in the network are being paired and doing this at the same time. Okay, so hopefully that's all clear. So what I'm going to do is discuss the first project that we ran in this program. And in this project, we were interested in interrogating that assumption that gossip needed to be accurate to be effective at shoring up cooperation. So in this experiment, we had almost 300 participants came into the lab as usual. They were interacting in networks of 12. So half of those, 6 of them would be investors, 6 would be agents, and they played 15 rounds of this trust, one-shot trust game. So what we did here is we manipulated whether or not reputational information was disseminated between investors between rounds. And if it was disseminated, what form did it take? And so there were 4 conditions that we had. There was a no message condition. And in this condition, participants were just paired up across the rounds and they played a one-shot trust game. They were paired up with someone else, they played another one, and there was no reputational information being exchanged. So they went in completely blind to each round. Then we had 3 reputational conditions. The first was a truth condition. And so here, when investors wrote their item of gossip, they were told that that message would be sent to the experimenter. So effectively, they sent a message, but nothing happened to it. And then from round 2 onwards, they received a factual description of what had happened in the previous round with the agent they were about to play. So this is like a perfect reputational system. Then we had the gossip condition, and that what happened there was exactly what I showed you in the slides before. But so investors were asked to write a numerical piece of gossip that would be read by their current agent's next investor. And from round 2 onwards, all investors received a message describing the previous behavior of their current agent. Now, as I said before, there is a general assumption that gossipers, will lie readily and that their information that they send will be very inaccurate, but we had no idea what they were going to do. So we just had to wait and see how much inaccuracy we actually saw in the gossip condition. And so we also had a condition, which we called inaccurate gossip, where we ensured that there would be very high levels of inaccuracy in the reputational information that was received. To do this, investors sent messages as usual, but they were told that the messages that they sent had a 50% chance of being misdelivered. So what this meant is that if you got a piece of gossip about your current agent, half of the time it would describe the previous behavior of the agent that you were interacting with. But half of the time it would be describing the behavior of some other agent, and you wouldn't know. So that information was suddenly becoming much less reliable. What we were interested in seeing, obviously, was how these different reputational conditions were able to shore up levels of trust in the network as a whole. So as I said, we weren't sure how much inaccuracy we would see in the gossip condition in particular, but in the reputation conditions in general. And so we did find some fairly substantial levels of spontaneous inaccuracy. So if we look across those three inaccuracy conditions, we found that over half of investors sent at least one inaccurate message. And across all messages, 21% of them were inaccurate. So you could say, well, there was reasonably high levels of inaccuracy. We also found that that rate of inaccuracy was the highest when it actually served some kind of purpose in the experiment. So in other words, when those messages were going to be read by other players in the gossip and the inaccurate gossip condition, the rates of inaccuracy were about 23 to 29%, whereas when those messages were being sent to the experimenter, there was still some inaccuracy, but only about 9%. So this is important in showing that the inaccuracy that we see here is not just a demand effect. It's not just the fact that we told people factually what had happened and then said, now tell someone else what you want them to know. So it didn't just create inaccuracy where there wouldn't have been inaccuracy anyway. So it really does seem as though people are being inaccurate for some kind of goal. So they're more inaccurate when they know that that message is going to be received. So what happened with levels of trust in those networks? So this figure summarizes the main result. And what I'd like to draw your attention to, well, first of all, on the y-axis, we have the number of ECU on average that was sent to agents. So ECU being the trust decision, this is an indication of levels of trust. And on the x-axis, we have the experimental round blocks, just aggregated in blocks of 5 to make it easier to see. So I draw your attention to the line at the bottom, and that's the no message condition. And in that condition, what you can see is that levels of trust start reasonably low and they get lower over time. So without reputational information, people aren't doing a particularly good job of shoring up levels of trust. Now, if we can look at the solid black line at the top there, that's the truth condition, the perfect reputational condition. What you can see is that people are starting higher and levels of trust are building over time. So clearly, if you get totally accurate reputational information, that's super helpful for shoring up levels of trust. Now, the really interesting line is the dashed line, which sits alongside the truth line at the top there. That's the gossip condition. Now, as I said, just over 20% of messages in that condition were inaccurate. So there was some level of inaccuracy and unreliability. And what we can see is that there's absolutely no significant difference in the average levels of trust between those two conditions. So having this level of accuracy, 20%, whether you think it's high or low, clearly that is not enough to be a problem for the ability of gossip to shore up cooperation. What about the really inaccurate condition? So that's the gray line in the middle. And so what's clearly visible there is that you don't get the same boost when the gossip has a really high chance of being inaccurate, but it's still better than nothing. So having some reputational information is better than having no reputational information, even if that information is really very inaccurate. So we wanted to understand why we were seeing these effects. So why is it that gossip is doing such a good job of shoring up cooperation or trust, even when there's that level of inaccuracy? So we then interrogated the two different mechanisms that I discussed at the beginning. So how are gossipers actually using that gossip to discriminate? And what is the impact of these different reputational conditions on whether or not agents will actually actively try and create a good reputation by being trustworthy? So first of all, to have a look at levels of discrimination, in this figure here, on the y-axis, again, we've got levels of trust, number of ECU sent by investors to their agents. And on the x-axis, we've got the content of the gossip that they receive. Now that gossip may be true or not. So the first category there is gossip which says that that agent returned nothing to me. Second category is that agent returned a small amount between 0 and 20%. The third category is that agent returned between 20% and 40%. And that's an important category, because we categorized being trustworthy as returning at least a third of the tokens that you received. Because if an agent returned at least a third of the tokens that they received, then they were ensuring that the investor didn't lose out through that interaction. The investor would get back what they had sent. And then the final category there is when the gossip said that the person sent more than 40%, returned more than 40%. So that's really trustworthy behavior. If you look at the solid black line, that's the truth condition, you can see it's got the steepest slope. So clearly, gossipers are basing their trust decisions most strongly on the content of gossip when that gossip is just factual descriptions of what people have said, when they know it's true. The next line up is the gossip condition. So when there is 20% of messages being inaccurate, you can see that that line is a bit flatter, particularly at the extremes. So we can see that in the gossip condition, gossipers seem to be being sensitive to the fact that there could be some lying, and they're not as sensitive to the content of gossip when they decide how to act. And then the final condition, the inaccurate gossip condition, that's the gray line, you can see is the flattest line. And so here, again, people know, well, this information may or may not be true, and so they don't act as strongly on it. So the least discrimination. But nonetheless, you can see that they still are paying attention to it. So they're not ignoring it entirely. So we can see that inaccuracy does have a negative effect on gossip-based discrimination. Does it have a negative effect on strategic reputation building? So here we've got the figure which demonstrates that. So this time on the y-axis, we've got the proportion of units that the agent decided to return to the investor. And this is a measure of trustworthiness. And so this tells us how hard those agents, well, how much they were being trustworthy, and also potentially how hard they were working to build up a good reputation so that they got sent more in the next round. Again, on the x-axis going to the right, we've got the experimental round aggregated into 5-round blocks. So if we look at the bottom there, that dashed line, the dotted line, that's the no message condition. And what you can see is that agents are really just not very trustworthy. They return less than 20% on average of what they receive. And that goes down over time, as I guess they realize they can get away with it. On the top, the solid black line, we've got the truth condition. And what you can see here is right from the beginning, agents are much more trustworthy to begin with. And if anything, they become more trustworthy over time. Now, in the gossip condition, where gossipers were paying less attention to the gossip, what we can see is that there's no significant difference between the truth condition and the gossip condition. So the gossip condition was potentially one where agents could have gotten away with being less trustworthy. But what we see here is they seem not to realize it. And arguably, they're being more trustworthy than they needed to be in this particular situation. In the inaccurate gossip condition, again, you can see that in line with the fact that they knew that messages were being misdelivered, they took advantage of that, and they were less trustworthy right from the beginning and throughout than in the other reputation conditions. But nonetheless, they were still being more trustworthy than in the no gossip condition. So what it suggests is that people are very sensitive to the fact that there is reputational information that is being exchanged in a network. And if they are told something that means that they understand that that information may be inaccurate, they can take advantage of it to some degree. But if they're just in an environment where gossipers are discriminating less, they don't seem to be able to actually pick up on that. And so they don't take advantage of the fact that gossipers are a bit less sure about how much to trust that gossip. So just to summarize that study and what we think it says, I think what it says is that this requirement or arguments that gossip needs to be accurate to be functional doesn't seem to hold in this particular setting, at least not a strong version of that argument. We've shown that if you have reasonable levels of inaccuracy, so 20% of messages, that does as well. as the truth. And if you have very high levels of inaccuracy, so over 50% of messages are wrong, that's still better than having nothing. Now, the reason why this inaccuracy seems to not have very big negative effects is we suspect because agents are just not that sensitive to levels of discrimination in the environment. So they seem to underestimate the impact that inaccuracy may have on investors' discrimination, and they're more trustworthy than they need to be. And because they're more trustworthy, investors are willing to trust. And so that shores up the levels of trust. So what this means is that if this is true, this kind of relationship, then what's one of the most important things about gossip is that people know it exists. Because if they know it exists, they'll have a reputational concern, and they will be fairly risk averse in their behaviors with others to ensure that they have a good reputation in case it helps later on. All right, so I'm going to go on to the next project. Just quickly. And as I said, in this project, we were interested in understanding a little bit more about when and why gossipers tell lies. So, people's claim that gossip is just going to be a kind of cheap talk. It's too easy to lie. It's easy to say whatever you want. And so it'll just become kind of like random noise that no one pays any attention to. So those arguments are made in some contexts anyway. We were interested in understanding this a little bit more. So in this study, we brought over 300 participants into the lab, same kind of setup, this time networks of 16. And we wanted to try and find one condition under which we thought gossipers were going to be particularly likely to lie. And so what we did is we manipulated the competition between gossipers. So we had a control condition where they weren't competing with each other. And then we had a competition condition where the gossipers were actually in competition. So how we did this is we overlaid a color onto the network. So half of investors were told that they were red and the other half were blue. And we also told agents that half were red or blue, but that doesn't matter really. So in the control condition, colors had no meaning. So there was no other strategic or material effect associated with the color of the interactants. In the competition condition though, color did have strategic meaning. And in particular, investors competed for a bonus that was awarded to the investors of the color that earned the most points over the course of that experimental session. So if, for instance, over all the rounds, the 4 red investors had earned the most, then each of them would get $5 and the blue investors would get nothing, and vice versa. Now, in the interaction, in all the interactions in both control and competition, everyone was aware of their own color and also the colors of everyone that they interacted with. So for investors, they would know the color of their agent. They would also know the color of the investor that they were sending gossip to, and they would know the color of the investor who was sending gossip to them. So we were hoping that by introducing competition between investors, that would then spark higher levels of deception and lying. But of course, we didn't know. So let's have a look at the rates of spontaneous inaccuracy. So here we found, again, substantial spontaneous inaccuracy. Just over a quarter of all messages were inaccurate. But importantly, we found that most lies were directed to outgroup competitors. So in other words, investors, a red investor was most likely to lie if they were sending gossip to a blue investor. And that can be seen in this figure here. So on the y-axis, we've got the proportion of messages sent to a given audience in a given treatment that were inaccurate. And on the left-hand two bars, when you're communicating to an in-group audience. In other words, if you're red, another red person, or if you're blue, another blue person. On the right-hand side, we've got when you're communicating to an out-group audience. So if you're red, you're sending a message to a blue investor. The control condition is the gray bars, and the competition treatment is the black bars. Now, what's very easy to see is that when you're communicating to a different color audience in the competition treatment, in other words, you're communicating to a competitor, almost half of the messages that you send are lies. Whereas if you're communicating with any other audience in either treatment, then it's about 20%. So clearly having competition between investors leads to them spontaneously lying much more. It is, though, very interesting to see that in all conditions, there is some level of lying. And again, we see about that 20% level. I mean, it was extraordinarily similar across those other audiences. So, you know, where people say that inaccuracy or lying is intrinsic to gossip, you know, this suggests that, yeah, to some degree, it seems to be. People certainly readily do it when, at least from our initial perspective, there's no good reason to. So we can see that there is more competition and more lying on average in the competition treatment, about over a third on average in that treatment. And in the control treatment, it's about 20% lies. Now, does that difference in the rate of lying or inaccuracy have an impact on levels of trust in those networks? So what I've got here is the average trust on the y-axis, experimental round. The control treatment is the gray line and the competition treatment is the black line. And what you can hopefully see very clearly is that there was no significant difference in levels of trust in those two networks. So the competition treatment had substantially more lying, but as in the first study I just described to you, it didn't seem to actually undermine levels of trust, which again speaks to the fact that gossip is pretty robust to inaccuracy. Again, we interrogated the two different mechanisms to understand why this could be. And so what I've got here is the regression coefficients for the how strongly the investors discriminated on the basis of the gossip that they received. And so at the top there, I've got two coefficients for the control condition, at the bottom, two coefficients for the competition condition. And on average, you can see that the control condition coefficient is around 10. And the competition condition coefficient is about half as strong. So effectively, gossipers are paying twice as much attention to the gossip when they decide how much to trust in the control condition than in the competition condition. So there's big differences in levels of discrimination. You can also see that in the competition condition, it matters who you get the message from. So if that message comes from an in-group member, your discrimination coefficient is about 7. And if it comes from an out-group member, it's more like 3.5. So in the competition treatment, everyone discriminates less, but you pay by far the least attention to a message that was sent to you by an out-group competitor. So you just don't trust that they're going to tell you the truth. So in other words, inaccuracy is having this expected effect on discrimination. What about reputation building? Here we've got the trustworthiness of agents in those two conditions over experimental rounds. The competition is the black and the control is the gray. And again, you can see there's no significant difference. So as in the first study that I described to you, it seems as though, yeah, we're boosting lying. There's more inaccuracy. Gossipers are aware of this and they're not paying as much attention to the gossip. There's much less discrimination happening. Nonetheless, agents are not sensitive to it. They can't adapt their behavior. And so agents in the competition treatment are being more trustworthy than they need to be. And this is then why the trust levels are staying so high. So that's largely a replication of before. What we can see, though, is we understand one condition under which people are going to be particularly likely to lie, but we wanted to go a little bit further than that. And so what I'll describe now is exploratory analyses that we conducted to get a sense of what kinds of lies people were telling and why they were telling those lies. So we developed a 2x2 typology of different kinds of lies. And the typology reflects the kind of agent that was being described. So are you sending a message about an agent who was untrustworthy? In other words, someone who returned less than a third. Or are you sending a message about a trustworthy agent, someone who sent at least a third or more of their points back? And your message, is your message saying that that agent is more negative than they actually were? Or is your lie saying that that agent is more positive than they actually were? When you intersect this, you get these 4 different kinds of lies. So you can see there negative exaggeration, positive misrepresentation, negative misrepresentation, and positive exaggeration. So you can see on the 2 diagonals, we have 2 similar kinds of lies. So on the diagonal from the top left, we've got what we call exaggeration. So exaggeration is a situation where I interact with someone who's untrustworthy, and in my gossip, I lie and I say they're even worse. Or bottom right, positive exaggeration. So I interact with someone who's trustworthy, and then I lie and say they're even more trustworthy than they were. The other diagonal is misrepresentation. And this is where I say I've interacted with a trustworthy agent. I say this person is actually untrustworthy, or vice versa. So I'm saying they're a different kind of agent. Someone who may benefit you is actually someone who may hurt you, and vice versa. So these lies were substantial. Just to give you a sense of how big they are, I'll summarize here the average content of the message versus the actual behavior that underlined that message. So in the case of positive misrepresentation, what the average gossip said was that I had sent about 7 tokens, and that agent had returned 10 to me. That's a pretty good rate of return. So this is a good agent. In actual fact, what had happened is that the person had actually sent closer to 5, and the agent had only on average returned 2. So in actual fact, they were a pretty terrible agent. Positive exaggeration. The investors were saying, I sent just over 8. Actually, I sent a bit less. And that agent returned 17, when actually they returned more like 10. Negative exaggeration. I sent 7. In actual fact, I sent more like 5. And this agent returned less than 1 when they returned a little bit closer to 2. And then negative misrepresentation, I sent 8, a little bit. In actual fact, it was just under that. And this person only returned about 5, when in actual fact, they returned closer to 11. So, what it certainly says is that when people are lying, on average, these are not small. They're huge, whopping lies. They're really completely distorting the underlying behavior. So why were they doing this? To understand what gossipers were trying to achieve through these lies, we examined 2 sources of data. So the first is, after this experiment, all investors were asked to complete a post-experimental questionnaire, where they gave 3 responses to questions of when they had lied and why they had described their agent truthfully, too positively, or too negatively. And we coded those according to the different kinds of social welfare motives that were involved. We also had an independent follow-up study, which was run online with a series of hypothetical trust games, where we asked investors to indicate what their social motives were, so how much they wanted to help or harm the agent that they were playing with and the investor they were gossiping to. And then we asked them to say how much sending different messages, the truth, positive lies, and negative lies, would help them to actually realize those social motives. I'm not going to go into detail into those findings, but effectively we found very consistent pattern of motives. So when people were justifying telling the truth, they said that they would use the truth for positive reciprocity to agents. They'd say, oh, well, this agent treated me well, therefore I will tell the truth about them. So telling the truth was seen as rewarding an agent. They also told the truth, not surprisingly, to help the audience. They're like, well, I told the truth because this way the audience has all the information and they can make the decision that works best for them. Exaggeration lies, they said they had 2 different reasons. So the first was establishing both positive and negative reciprocity with an agent. So they'd say, well, this agent, was super trustworthy. And so I want to make sure they get rewarded in the next round. So I'll describe them as being even better than they were. Or this agent returned less than they should have, and I want to ensure they get punished in the next round. So I'll say they're even worse than they were. Participants also said that they thought that their exaggeration lies would help the audience, because it was kind of like giving the audience good advice, really encouraging them to do the right thing, to invest in good agents and to not invest in bad agents. So the other kind of lies, the misrepresentation lies, are kind of the prototypical harmful lies, what people often think about. And here what people said is, yeah, I told those lies just directly to harm the audience. I was trying to encourage them to do the wrong thing, to engage in costly actions. So this is what gossipers say they're trying to do with those different kinds of lies. Do we have any evidence that they actually do that? Well, there is some evidence consistent with this. So first of all, what I'll look at is the impact of the different kinds of lies on whether or not, on how agents were treated as a function of how their behavior was described. And so do these lies, or does exaggeration, achieve reciprocity? So in this figure, what we show is the payoff that an agent who is untrustworthy in a given round gets in the subsequent round. as a function on the x-axis of whether their behavior was described truthfully, whether it was exaggerated, or whether it was misrepresented. And so what you can see, we've got the two conditions there, control in the light gray, competition in the darker color. I won't draw much attention to them because the findings are pretty consistent, except that the effects are a bit stronger in control, which makes sense given that levels of discrimination were much higher in the control condition. So if the truth was told about these agents, on average, their payoff was just under 8. If their behavior was exaggerated, their payoffs were much lower than that. So exaggeration is useful for negative reciprocity. Misrepresentation, on the other hand, is the worst approach for reciprocity. So these agents actually were doing really well if the lie was a misrepresentation one. What about if we look at trustworthy agents? We find the same pattern. So here, trustworthy agents whose behavior was truthfully described earned just under 12 in the next round. If it was exaggerated, if anything, in the control condition, they did somewhat better. So it helped to reward agents. And misrepresentation, they did worse. So misrepresentation is establishing the opposite of reciprocity. So generally, exaggeration works to achieve reciprocity. What about the effect on the audience? And in particular, did misrepresentation harm the audience here? So this is quite a complicated figure. So I just want to draw your attention to the right side of it, which is the competition treatment. So what we've got here is the proportion of messages about untrustworthy agents that were lies, different kinds of lies, exaggeration lies and misrepresentation lies. So the in-group audience is the gray and the out-group competitors are the darker gray lines. If you look at what kinds of lies are sent to competitors, that's the dark bars on the right, you can see that people send more misrepresentation to competitors than they do exaggerations. They're sending more of the harmful lies to competitors. When they're communicating to allies, if anything, they're sending more exaggeration than misrepresentations. They're sending more of the lies that they think are helping that particular audience. If we look at the same figure for trustworthy agents, we see the same basic pattern. So if you look at those dark bars on the right, when people are lying to competitors, they're misrepresenting. If we look at the light gray bars, if anything, if they're lying to allies, they're exaggerating. So gossipers are acting on what they say they think those lies are doing. But does it actually matter in terms of audience payoffs? So here is the investor payoffs after they've interacted with a trustworthy agent. Sorry, I'm going to talk. Sorry, I'm going to talk. So after they've interacted with a trustworthy agent. And so what you can see is this is the payoff when they receive a truthful message. They get just over 12. If they receive an exaggeration message, at least in the control condition, they don't get any more. They don't do any worse. So it seems as though exaggeration is not harming the audience as much as misrepresentation lies on the right are. So misrepresentation, at least when you're interacting with a trustworthy agent, is more harmful. If you're interacting with an untrustworthy agent, we didn't actually find any clear difference in terms of payoffs as a function of the kind of lie that you received. So some weak evidence that maybe misrepresentation lies are actually achieving what people are trying to in terms of harming the audience, but the effect is not very strong, which suggests that gossipers are just able to adapt fairly well to how reliable they think that message is going to be. So just quickly to summarize that particular study. So we find in terms of when gossipers lie, well, competition is one thing that increases lies. But again, as in the first study, that the level of lying that we see anyway was not enough to decrease levels of trust. And it didn't diminish levels of trustworthiness on the part of the agents. We also found that gossipers lie to achieve a range of goals. Most important is reciprocity with agents and also trying to both hurt and help audiences. So they're really trying to do quite a lot of things through their dishonesty. To do this, they select among 4 different kinds of lies. And, we think it's really interesting to realize that exaggeration lies are actually maybe really helpful. So when lies are described as being problematic, then that really applies to misrepresentation lies, but much less to exaggeration lies, which may actually fulfill reputational functions more effectively than the truth does. So I think I've got about 10 minutes left. Is that right? Yep, super. Okay, I'll just go on to very quickly the last study that I'm going to present. So Jose Luis was talking about a very recent special issue that came, that was published, and Carolee, one of the editors. And so this is a paper that we have published in that special issue. And what I would say is that, it's very much a first attempt to look at this particular question of whether there are social sanctions for gossipers. And so, it's very provisional data, and it'll be great to see what other people do in this line of work as well. So very similar basic setup, same kind of paradigm, but with one important difference. So we wanted to know whether people would impose costs on gossipers who sent inaccurate messages. So we started with our basic paradigm, which you're familiar with now, of say an investor sending a piece of gossip about an agent to an audience. That audience then goes and plays the trust game with that agent. And in the process of that, we assume that that agent is behaving more or less like the investor expected on the back of the gossip. So there is a chance there of saying, well, it seems as though that gossip may not have been accurate. Of course, hard to be sure. But either the agent behaved in the expected way or they did not. And so after that, that's the standard agent trust game. We get investors to play a second trust game, and this is the gossiper trust game. So they're then told, okay, well, now your partner in the same game is the gossiper who sent you that piece of gossip. If you are to play the trust game with that person, how many tokens are you going to send them? So that's our measure of how much they trust the gossiper in a separate game as a function of how much of whether or not the message that they received was true. So we did two experiments. The one was an online experiment where participants played a series of hypothetical trust games. This is obviously very useful because we could set up a population where they knew that they would have some messages, they would be playing with some agents that were good and some agents that were not good. And they were also told that gossipers could tell the truth or they could sometimes lie. So that was kind of set up. And then we could have them interact with good and bad agents, and we could have them receive truthful and non-truthful gossip. And so then in each round, and they played 12 of these, they would first play a standard agent trust game, and then they would say how many points they would send to the gossiper if they were to play the trust game with that gossiper. We also then had a second behavioral study where we brought 160 participants into the lab to save ourselves money and make things a bit simpler. Rather than bringing in different bunches of agents at the same time, we had them play with agent strategies. And so these strategies were strategies that were generated by an actual group of participants a couple of weeks before the study started. And they were asked what they would do in every kind of situation of the trust game. So if an investor sent them 1, how many would they return? Up to 10, and so on. And so those strategies were programmed, and the participants were actually paid on the back of how their strategies performed in the study proper. But so what that meant is that we had programmed strategies that the investor participants were playing against and gossiping about. To try and, in a behavioral study like this, we're obviously relying on spontaneous lies. So we needed to try and boost the number of lies that people told. And we did this by using competition again. But this time it wasn't between groups, it was just at the individual level. So in a given session, they were told that if you, over the course of the study, earn in the top 50% of participants in the session, you will then get a bonus. If you're in the bottom 50%, you don't get a bonus. And so that did work pretty well for generating spontaneous lying. So we had about 36% of messages were lies. Okay, so I'm just going to very quickly, one other important thing about the behavioral study is that although they played a number of rounds of agent trust games, we only asked them to play the gossiper trust game once at the very end of the study. So after they'd played their final agent trust round, we said, okay, now you're playing something new. You're going to play the same trust game, but this time you're going to be in deciding or interacting with the gossiper who just sent you that piece of gossip. And they were reminded about the outcomes of that previous round. And we can only do that once, because if social sanctions actually work, and we'd introduced it from the beginning of the study, there was a risk that we would have no lying. So we couldn't have that. So effectively, we've got one round, 160 participants, and as many lies as we see in that round. And there were about, again, 37% of those messages were lies. So what did we see in the hypothetical context? Here's the level of trust that people showed towards gossipers as a function of whether they were interacting with a bad agent or a good agent, and whether that agent's behavior had been described truthfully, that's the black bars, or there had been a negative lie, that's the dark gray bars on the left, or there had been a positive lie, that's the light gray bars on the right. So what you can see is that the black bars, in both cases for good and bad agents, are higher, and they're significantly higher in most cases, than the bars associated with the lies. So in this hypothetical setting, anyway, it seems as though people are more willing to trust gossipers who told them the truth about an agent than to trust gossipers who told them a lie about an agent. So it does seem as though there may be some social sanctions to lying. Something else I just want to draw your attention to is the fact that the truth bar for good agents on the right is actually higher than the truth bar for bad agents on the left, which suggests that there's actually a valence effect going on. So in other words, interestingly, they were more willing to trust gossipers who told the truth about a good agent. So in other words, who said truthfully, yeah, this agent is trustworthy. And if a gossiper said truthfully, this agent is untrustworthy, they had slightly lower trust levels. And this is relevant for the next study. Okay, so here what I've got is the same figure for our behavioral study where we were relying on spontaneous lies. Now, what you can see in that figure is the two outside bars are missing. And this is because the lies were spontaneous. Unfortunately, we just got too few lies in those two categories. So the negative lies about bad agents, the extreme left bar, and the positive lies about good agents, the extreme right bar, both of those had fewer than 5 lies. So we really couldn't say anything about how people treat gossipers who take those kinds of lies. For the other kinds of lies, we had higher numbers, about 27 or 28 lies. So what we can see, though, is how much people trusted the gossiper as a function of whether that gossiper told the truth about a bad agent, that's the left-hand black bar, or the truth about a good agent, that's the right-hand black bar, or they told a positive lie about a bad agent, light-colored bar on the left-hand set, or they told a negative lie about a good agent. And what you can see is that clearly there is no straightforward advantage to telling the truth. So in the case of good agents, yeah, they do trust gossipers who tell the truth more than they trust gossipers who tell negative lies. But in the case of bad agents, they actually trust gossipers who tell the truth about that bad agent less than they trust gossipers who tell positive lies. What we're in fact seeing here is a much stronger valence effect. In other words, gossipers who said positive things about their agent, either truthfully or as a lie, were trusted more than gossipers who said negative things, whether or not that was truthful. And this is actually consistent with other previous work, which shows that the valence of gossip is really important for the way in which audiences judge gossipers. And in particular, people who say nice things are generally perceived to be more moral people, kinder people than people who say negative things. And so that seems to be an effect that is coming through here. So it doesn't matter whether you told the truth or not, you said something nice about someone, and therefore I think you're a nice person and you're worth trusting. Now, this is just one study, and given that it required on spontaneous lies, we certainly don't have the sample and potentially the reliability that we would like. But it does suggest that social sanctions in a behavioral sense may not be so straightforward. In other words, people may not act on what they believe to be truth or lies in the way that we would expect straightforwardly. So a very quick summary here. We find that people say they're more likely to say they're going to punish gossipers who share inaccurate gossip than to do it. They also appear to be much more sensitive to the valence of the gossip than to its accuracy, at least when they're having to then decide whether they trust someone or not. And so social sanctions, this suggests, is likely to be a pretty imperfect mechanism for suppressing gossipers' lies, but very provisional. So just to draw that all together then, we don't support a strong assumption that gossip needs to be accurate. Of course, this is a very particular context that we're looking at, but what we found overwhelmingly is that gossip is pretty robust as long as people know that gossip exists. It seems to raise enough reputational concern that mean it does benefit. We do seem to suggest that, yeah, gossipers do lie pretty readily. Inaccuracy may be an intrinsic part of gossip, but not all lies are harmful. So exaggeration lies seem to be serving particular purposes. And it's interesting to think about the fact that, misrepresentation is harmful, but exaggeration may actually be useful, at least from a reputational functions perspective. What this suggests is that we don't maybe need mechanisms that can control lies that much. But interestingly, this early evidence suggests that any mechanisms that do exist probably operate pretty imperfectly. Okay, so I think that's me. So I'll stop sharing now and answer any questions if you have.
Thank you, Kim. Karen, did you stop the recording? I cannot do it from here.